Hello, Professor Berg and fellow students of EDU 506, Foundations of Education. My name is Trent Youthy. I am doing my modern theorist presentation on Howard Gardner and his theory of multiple intelligences. Now, Gardner was the son of German Jewish immigrants who escaped from Germany prior to World War II. He was born in Scranton, Pennsylvania in 1943. Growing up, he was an avid piano player and an enthusiastic participant in the arts. One of his early professional goals was to find a place for the arts within academic psychology. He graduated from Harvard University in 1965 with an A.B. in social relations. He continued his studies at Harvard and eventually obtained a Ph.D. in developmental psychology. Now, in 1967, Gardner became a founding member of what would become known as Project Zero, which was and continues to be a research organization made up of scholars from multiple disciplines dedicated to learning in and through the arts. As his doctoral studies were coming to a close, he encountered the neurological research of Norman Geschwind and became fascinated by the latter's investigation into the effects of individuals suffering from various forms of brain damage. Now, this eventually led Gardner to publish the book The Shattered Mind in 1975, documenting how different parts of the brain control different cognitive functions. With the aid of a sizable grant received in 1979, from the Bernard Van Leer Foundation, Gardner and a cohort of younger colleagues conducted extensive research which synthesized symptoms of brain damage with cognitive development. This research ultimately led to the publication in 1983 of his seminal work entitled Frames of Mind, The Theory of Multiple Intelligences. It was this book that challenged the traditional view of intelligence and laid the groundwork for what would become an educational revolution. Now, at the heart of multiple intelligence theory is the concept of intelligence itself. In an article entitled Multiple Intelligences Go to School, Educational Implications of the Theory of Multiple Intelligences, which was authored by Howard Gardner and Thomas Hatch, although Gardner, I believe, was more of an aide, Hatch being the primary author. That article starts with this sentence. It says, despite swings of the pendulum between theoretical and applied concerns, the concept of intelligence has remained central to the field of psychology. Now, Francis Galton, who was the cousin of Charles Darwin, was perhaps the first psychologically oriented scientist to try to measure the intellect directly. However, being a committed eugenicist, he sought to measure intelligence and hoped through proper quote-unquote breeding to increase the overall intelligence of the population. So we have definitely come a long way since Galton. From Galton to Gardner, we see Binet and Terman, who developed the first general-purpose intelligence tests in their respective countries, being France and the United States, what we would now call the general IQ tests. Now, as a result of his own studies of the development and breakdown of cognitive and symbol-using capacities, Gardner became convinced that the Piagetian view of intellect was flawed. Whereas Piaget had conceptualized all aspects of symbol use as part of a single semiotic function, empirical evidence was accruing that the human mind may be quite modular in design. That is, separate psychological processes appear to be involved in dealing with linguistic, numerical, pictorial, gestural, and other kinds of symbolic systems. Now, according to Gardner's theory of multiple intelligences, each human being is capable of 7 relatively independent forms of information processing, with individuals differing from one another in the specific profile of intelligences that they exhibit. Now, what that means, I guess in lay terms, is that whereas traditionally intelligence was something that was thought of as a singular unit, a singular system, Gardner said, well, hold up, wait, the brain does not function on that simplistic a level. Each individual person has what he called an intellectual profile. Now, some individuals will have talents or capacities, strengths, if you will, much higher in certain aspects, in certain capacities than others. Really quickly, I'm going to run through the 7 different capacities or the intelligences that he delineates in his book, Frames of Mind. Now, the first one he calls logical mathematical, with end states, basically careers, the end states of education, being a scientist or a mathematician. The core components of the logical mathematical intelligence is sensitivity to and capacity to discern logical or numerical patterns, ability to handle long chains of reasoning. Now, another one of these intelligences he called linguistics, with the end states being that of a poet, think Shakespeare, or a journalist. The core components being sensitivity to the sounds, rhythms, and meanings of words, sensitivity to the different functions of language. Another capacity, talent, or intelligence that he delineated in that book was the musical intelligence, end states being composer, violinist, or general musician. The core components obviously being abilities to produce and appreciate rhythm, pitch, and timbre, and an appreciation of the forms of musical expressiveness. Another one of these intelligences was spatial. 2 of the end states that he specifically points out are that of the navigator, the pilot, the captain, or the sculptor, with core components being capacities to perceive the visual spatial world accurately and to perform transformations on one's initial perceptions. Another being the bodily kinesthetic, what we would think of as athletes or dancers or those who use their body in their profession. Core components being ability to control one's body movements and to handle objects skillfully. I also think of, professional street performers, or circus performers, or let's say members of Cirque du Soleil. And there's 2 more that he points out here in his initial book, Frames of Mind. One of those is interpersonal end states, being therapists and salesmen, among other. Their core components are the capacities to discern and respond appropriately to the moods, temperaments, motivations, and desires of other people. And finally, we have the intrapersonal end states, being a person a person with detailed, accurate self-knowledge. Think of pastors, think of monks, think of people who are generally just very self-aware. They know who they are, they know their strengths, they know their weaknesses, they know how to control their own behavior. The core components here are access to one's own feelings and ability to discriminate among them and draw upon them to guide behavior, knowledge of one's own strengths, weaknesses, desires, and intelligences. Now, what are the implications of MI theory, or multiple intelligence theory, on the 21st century classrooms. On a more practical level, Gardner was disturbed by the nearly exclusive stress in school on two forms of symbol use, namely linguistic symbolization and logical mathematical symbolization. Now, although these two forms are obviously important in a scholastic setting, other varieties of symbol use also figure prominently in human cognitive activity within and especially outside of school. Moreover, the emphasis on linguistic and logical capacities was overwhelming in the construction of items on intelligence, aptitude, and achievement tests. That is to say that Gardner saw a dominance in traditional education on what he called the linguistic and logical mathematical intelligences. Now, to be successful in school, then, one would either have to be inherently talented in those intelligences, or they would have to try really, really, really hard to develop those intelligences. So those students who were traditionally more adept at those intelligences would be the ones that we would consider successful students, whereas let's say a student or an individual that was more talented in the bodily, kinesthetic, or the musical intelligences might have been left behind. Now, since Gardner's initial publication of Frames of Mind, and since his idea of multiple intelligences have taken root and have really taken on a life of their own, there have been multiple schools and districts that have taken MI theory sort of as a foundation. Now, these classrooms are filled with miniature replicas and props that invite children to deploy linguistic intelligence within the context of storytelling, household objects that children can take apart and reassemble, challenge children's spatial intelligence in a mechanical task, a quote-unquote discovery area including natural objects like rocks, bones, and shells, enables children to use their logical abilities to conduct small experiments, comparisons, and classifications, and group activities such as a bi-weekly creative movement session can be employed to give children the opportunity to exercise their bodily kinesthetic intelligence on a regular basis. So what does this mean for, again, the 21st century classroom? Being a Spanish teacher at the high school level in 2018, I still feel we are very, very, very much, I don't want to say stuck, but entrenched in this standardized test, again, kind of a cookie-cutter mentality of if students learn the material, i.e., they learn the vocabulary, they can regurgitate the vocabulary, they can conjugate the verbs, and they can reproduce that in standardized tests, then they are successful students. I think that taking into account more of the intelligences that Gardner points out, like the musical, like the interpersonal, like the visual spatial, I feel like that can, more than anything, bring out the strengths and weaknesses in all students, and especially those students who have traditionally been neglected by what we would call a traditional educational background. Now, do I think MI theory is the solution to all of our problems? Of course not. But I do believe that incorporating elements of MI